Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Liberatory Leadership Conference for our panel, We Can't Fail, the future rests on our shoulders. I'm going to go over our POP, so just our purpose and our outcomes, and then we have three fabulous panelists who I'm excited to moderate today and talk about this subject around rest, okay? So our purpose is to investigate and uproot the root causes behind the culture of urgency that leads liberatory leaders, in particular leaders of color, to work relentlessly towards liberation and deprioritize rest. And what we hope to get out of this panel, when we finish, we want to highlight some disparities between the burdens that POC leaders navigate compared to their white counterparts when doing liberatory work. Have you all, the participants, articulate the root causes behind the culture of urgency that guides their organizations, that you all leave with language and tools to advocate for yourselves and your organizations without depleting your personal resources. And we articulate rest as a political imperative if we want to win and sustain our wins while holding the nuance of individualized versus communal care. So that is our agenda. That's our purpose while we're together. And we'll start with some introductions. I'm Avery Bazell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the managing director at the Center for Third World Organizing, and we'll be moderating this panel today. And I will kick it to my M4BL work wife, Kayla Reed.
Well, thank you. Hi. Hi, everyone. Kayla Reed, she, her. I am the executive director of Action St. Louis and Action St. Louis Power Project, which are local Black organizations here in St. Louis. We work on a few issues: electoral justice, democracy expansion, abolition, and housing justice. Theory of change is one of invest, divest, contest. So that is the work we do every day here in St. Louis. When I'm not doing that, which is never, I'm also one of the co-leads of the Electoral Justice Project of the Movement for Black Lives, which is the C4 arm of M4BL that really works to build the capacity of Black organizations to strengthen their ability to contest for power in this country. It's a pleasure to be here today. Did you want me to pass it to someone?
Yeah, pass it.
Okay,
I was muted, sorry.
I'll pass it to CJ.
Thank you, Kayla. Thank everybody for being here. First, I want to say that I come in the names of Kendrick Johnson. I come in the names of Mark Wilson. I come in the names of Ahmaud Arbery. I am the organizing manager for C2, Center for Third World Organizing, which Avery is my colleague and comrade in our fight for liberation. I also work with Tef Poe and Kayla in St. Louis with an organization called Black Men Build as the co-field director with Tef Poe from St. Louis that works very closely with Kayla. To answer, my pronouns are him, he. And to answer the final question of how did I get started in this work? I've always been a freedom fighter, Avery. I was born one ever since I was little. And ever since I saw the Black men wearing I Am a Man and saw the water hoses being placed upon our women and children and the dogs biting our women and children. And as a young person, I felt like integration was all we got from slavery. And I didn't understand how they could take our land and our resources and rape us and lynch us and burn us. And all we got was the bubblers sign removed and the ability to live next door to them in housing. And so it just didn't sit right with me. And so I'm coming back for everything that they owe. And I pass it to my brother, Sean.
Thanks, CJ. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Thomas Breitfeld. I'm co-executive director of the Building Movement Project, which is a national organization that does research on the nonprofit sector with a particular focus on issues of race and leadership in the sector. And prior to my work here at BMP, I did work in national organizing organizations, particularly working on comprehensive immigration reform and racial justice campaigns.
Appreciate that. And I know y'all talked about, you and CJ talked about your coming in the movement, but we skipped that for Kayla. So Kayla, you want to talk about how you came in the movement? What brought you in the movement?
Yeah, sure. I came into the movement on August 9th, 2014, when Mike Brown was gunned down in St. Louis County, called to the world Ferguson. I'm from St. Louis. I was born here. I've lived here all my life. I've lived in some of the most divested, decimated parts of our region, and experienced many of the systems that we talk about. But that moment was catalyzing for me, to see my community, to be in relationship to people who are now my, lifelong comrades. As first a protester, not really understanding what that moment was going to mean to a larger movement, but that I was going through my own political awakening. And so for many months on end, I found myself in the streets of St. Louis and ended up becoming an organizer with the Organization for Black Struggle, which had been in St. Louis for many decades at that point. Worked there on anti-carceral work. That's also where I sort of got shaped into thinking about what is our vision for democracy, what is the work of Black organizations and the conversation around elections, and what is our role around Black voters, and how do these issues talk to each other. I was preparing to leave OBS to go back to school in 2016, and sort of three very pivotal things happened that summer that sort of recalibrated my commitment to movement space. I felt like I was going back to school to sharpen my tools, but that summer of 2016 was the Post nightclub shooting. Philando Castile was killed, and so was Alton Sterling. Philando Castile is actually from St. Louis and is buried here. And so to be 2 years out of Ferguson and to experience watching that video, to experience being a queer Black person and watching the insufficient coverage of what happened at the Post nightclub in Alton Sterling in 2016 really reaffirm my commitment to organizing as a principle and to answering the question, which I feel like is my life work, is like, what is Black power actually mean? How do we build it? How do we keep it? And how do we leverage it to transform our communities? And so with that sort of regrounding, myself and a crew of folks started what was called St. Louis Action Council, or reconvened St. Louis Action Council. And over the course of the last, how many years is that, 6? Over the course of the last 6 years, that has morphed into a full staff organization, Action St. Louis, and we've been able to do many things in that time, in all three of the areas that we focused on, with our eye on the prize of what is Black political power in St. Louis? How do we build it? How do we sustain it? How do we leverage it to improve our communities and transform our material conditions? And so, yeah, that's how I got started. Forever and always, Mike Brown forever.
Appreciate that. So we are going to be talking about rest, and before this panel started, we thought it was pretty interesting that this is the panel on rest, because we don't be resting. That's why we're trying not to fail, okay? But our first question to our panelists is rest an important element of our movement work? And I'll kick it to whoever wants to answer.
I mean, I'll say yes. I think that the challenge is the models for what we think of as rest, right? So if we think of rest as the sort of the waning of active energy in organizing that builds up to a peak when you're in a campaign, and then like you either win or lose that campaign, and then you take a break, regroup, evaluate what worked, and then figure out how to build towards the next thing. Like if that's the mode of rest that we're talking about, then I absolutely think that rest is critical, because it's about both taking that pause to do some work internally and collectively to prepare for the next push, right? I think the challenge often, and I think this is something I'm hearing a lot from leaders, is that the push and demand for rest is a push, is experienced by a lot of leaders as a demand for staff to not have to do work, right? And so that is different from rest after some like major initiative or major push on a campaign. And so, it's the idea then is that like rest has to be thought of as like a moment in preparation for the next fight, not necessarily a permanent state of like being able to just build in rest every day of your working week. That would be my sort of view and sort of the critique, I would say, of the way that rest sometimes or too often is getting talked about in our sector.
That's what's up, Sean. Okay, I'm gonna jump in real quick. When we were talking about it earlier, and then listening to Sean, Avery, I started like paying attention. For me, I think that when you operate on a lower frequency in this existence of capitalism, of white supremacy, of violence in our communities, of gossip, of trying to pay your bills, of trying just to survive, put food on the table, hanging with negative friends or negative energy. When you operate on a lower frequency, there's a need for more rest to be a freedom fighter, right? But when you move with integrity, when you move with love, when you move with humility, when you move with empathy personally, right? And and we're not perfect. When you are working on yourself every day to be a better human being, to be a better father, to be a better family man, then, and when you know who your true enemy is, and you know that you have to rest up to fight this system, then less rest is needed for those other things because you're operating on a higher frequency. So even when you're fighting your enemy, even when you're supposed to be resting, you're really not. So if I'm at a nightclub organizing, I found LaShonda Campbell, who ended up being an amazing organizer. If I'm at a funeral paying my respects, I'm still an organizer, freedom fighter. I found I found Lanisha Martin. If I'm at a training, I found Oscar Kane. And so the rest is for us to strategize for our liberation. The rest is for our wellness, to keep fighting the good fight, because as we was laughing earlier, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. And until we are liberated, we all get sleep, you go to sleep, but everybody that's an organizer, freedom fighter, strategist, or who really believe, they know that when we wake up in the morning, our whole mission is for us to get free.
Yeah. So this made me think about a lot. One is like, is rest an important element of our movement work? It should be, right? It should be important because in this work, we have to acknowledge that this work is hard, right? It's hard mentally, it's hard spiritually, it's hard physically. We have committed to being in the margins of margins and organizing people who are consistently suffering, who are in prolonged suffering, right? Who are detached from their power, and we're working to bring them into this work as organizers, right? And we're working to develop them in this work as organizers. And that work is taxing, right? It's hard. It's 1:30 in St. Louis, and I haven't eaten anything today but a bag of chips, right? And so there's this context of like the work is never ending and it's intense, and we have to hold and acknowledge that to people. This work is not easy, right? And it will not stop. And so if we're making a lifelong commitment to the pursuit of liberation, how do we both move with the urgency to alleviate suffering and create the balance so that we can actually have some rejuvenating periods, right? I think that dance is really hard because the urgency of now, right? The climate is changing around us, literally. Police are continuing to kill our folks. The political infrastructure is moving rapidly toward fascism, right? We we know the threats, and we understand that we are the front line and really the only defense as movement builders against these like oppressive regimes that are taking hold of our country. And so how do you rest in the face of that? Right. And so, and that question is hard to answer. And so what I tend to think about is two things. One, there is the impact of exhaustion on our work. When you don't sleep, they recommend that you don't drive, right? Because you cannot see clearly. Your responsiveness is slower to things that are happening, right? So if you're in a car and you're exhausted, your response time to hit your brakes is slower. Your response time to see someone crossing the lane is slower, which could then create more pathways for harm. You harming yourself and you harming others. That same context is very applicable to movement work. If we are not rested, we cannot see clearly. We are not our most strategic selves. We are not sharp tools in the toolbox to make sure that we're getting to our destination, right? And so I think we have to acknowledge that there is an impact of exhaustion. And I think we need to work together to define what is actually rest, because we drop rest, right? As Sean said, we drop rest into sort of a detachment from this work, right? To unplug is to rest. And I don't think that that's the only way to define rest. I don't think that's the only way to define balance, right? I think that there has to be, I tell my team this all the time, sometimes we are working hard because we're not doing the most important type of work. When there are more hands, when there's another person in the car who's able to drive, we don't delay in getting to our destination. There are more people around us to facilitate the work that has to happen. And so we have to remember that our primary work is to bring people into this work so that this work can be shared amongst us, so that there's more of a culture of balance, so that there can be a rest, more rest periods. The last thing I'll say is that I think we need to move away from this conversation around individual rest, right? There has to be like a collective rest. And so, yeah, I'm very tired, but if my entire team is tired, if our entire movement is tired, how do we take collective rest periods? And so for us, and even inside of our organization, you know, we're closed the week after the election. Everything may not come down the way we want it to. Our team will be nimble, but we take a collective rest, because it doesn't matter if I go on 5 days of PTO. If I come back to a culture of an overworked team and an exhausted team, then I still have to be the primary driver because everyone else can't see right? And so I think that this like collective rest is really important. And this like, what is rest that is not unplugging, but is actually like restoring and rejuvenating, and how can that be done in community? I feel rest if CJ and I go out to dinner after work, right? I feel rest in having spaciousness in my living room for folks to come over and kick it together, right? I don't need complete separation from the work that is in my heart, right? That work actually feeds me. And if that work is not feeding you, then you actually need to question why you're in the work, because I don't need to be away from something that's feeding me. I just need to balance, right, what that feels like. So that's what I would say.
Can I just add my appreciation for what both of you added? Because the piece Kayla raised around like, how do we think about rest as not being a disconnection from the work, right? Like, I do think it's very important because, you know, that then puts rest in the context of what CJ said, which was that we're resting up, right? And I do think that resting up is a very different thing from rest. And so if we think about what we're trying to do in movement spaces is rest up for the fight that is next and continuing and all of that, that feels to me like a qualitatively different way of talking about this need or demand that people inside of movement organizations have for rest, that it's about resting up collectively, as Kayla said. I think that what I am, you know, unfortunately seeing and hearing in terms of some of the burdens, and this is where it relates to some of the research that we do, like the particular burdens that end up falling on leaders of color, particularly Black leaders, particularly Black women, in this moment post-COVID, but it was certainly heightened during COVID, was that, there was a lot of space that organizations and leaders were making for their teams to rest, to disconnect, to not be so burdened by the day-to-day work. But the realities of running organizations didn't change. And so then the burden just was shifting to leaders. And that sometimes, particularly given the emotional toll of that period of time, and the gendered and racialized ways that people think about care and who's obligated to give care and show care, that was on top of already added burdens on women of color as leaders, right? So they were leading organizations, running organizations, letting staff do less, and also taking on more of the emotional burden and sort of emotional and psychological burden of caretaking for their staff teams, while also having to do the same thing for family members, right? So I think that there's this piece that I do think we're going to have to reckon with around what is the balance, and how, particularly for people in leadership roles in organizations, does the demand for rest not just mean more burden on leaders to do more of the work of keeping organizations afloat?
Yeah, that was it. That was for me.
Yes.
That was absolutely for me. I don't know if other people needed to hear it, but that was for me. And yeah, I think that's the most important. I know you have to move on, but I think that sort of like orientation to the question is like, if one person is resting, that work is still moving. And so what is the balance? Like, what is the actual collective analysis of rest, right? And of understanding what rest is. I struggle deeply with identifying that I work at a nonprofit, right? I made a commitment to be in movement work. If that assignment leads me to C2, then that work, right, is like, there is never a time where I can say, I'm off today. I'll deal with, I can't, like, don't call me, I'm off today, right? And that is hard, because sometimes you do want to not think about work. But also, if you are defining it as a job and not our political infrastructure to actually liberate our communities, or actually, like, if we're defining it as work, as a job in this context, and I think that moves us into this sort of like, what actually is this I versus the it, right? It's me versus the organization. Which thing is getting more? And it's like, actually, when the organization is strong, there is room for me to rest. And when I am rested, the organization is strong. And those two things have to be in tandem with each other. It's not a versus.
Yeah.
Let me hop in, babe, for real.
Come on with it then. Come on with it. We can just
Hey,
do this question.
you
Y'all
said that
have
collective-
church, okay?
When you said that collective, that touched my soul, because it's good to know that organizations who are in community together, because that's what Chin and Avery at C2 stress about collective wellness and taking days off. So that was very, 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 very powerful to me. That stood out to me. That's what I wanted to add, Avery. But also too, it's hard to take days off and rest, because when you are true to this work, Ave, and you are on solidarity calls with these families whose kids or loved ones have been murdered, when you're doing strategy with the lawyers of these families, and you become a part of their family, right? Like, I'm blessed to be able to like stay in Airbnbs and go to breakfast and go to Sunday dinners and go to church with these families. They become my family. So yeah, my vacation from this organization might say that I'm taking this day off, but when that phone ring and this family loved one is murdered, or they got to go to trial, or their kid is locked up, it doesn't sit well with me in my spirit to say I'm on vacation. And so finding that balance, as we've been talking about, of resting, I can't shut, me personally, I can't shut off. When that phone rings and I see these names of these families who are dependent on me just to say, we still fighting. I don't have to be on there for an hour, but just to pick up that phone and say, yes, I love you. I'm still here for you. I'm fighting for you. It means everything to them. And so that's the balance where we have to find the rest at. But thank y'all for sharing that, because I'm really like, I'm on 10 with y'all. This is dope.
Yeah. Appreciate the jewels so far. So I'm gonna get into our next question, which is, what's at stake for our people, our organizations, and ourselves if we cannot hold the balance of rest and political rigor?
Everything. Winning, helping people. I think like there is what you just said, CJ, made me think about in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. I was on leave because my father, Avery, I know you remember this, my father had they found blockage in his heart and he had to have emergency bypass surgery. And he went in for surgery, and that like the same day as the surgery is the same day George Floyd, this news broke. And people started, people are calling, what's going on? We need to, people are like this movement response moment started to take hold, right? And what that meant for me was like, I wanted to have full attention on my father, who was having a surgery where they have to stop his heart. And also I knew that my father would wake up from that and know that I was completely tormented, like I was completely torn, right? To be like, and what I felt in that moment was actually the love and support of my team, right? My comrades, to say, hey, I know folks are calling you, redirect them to me so that you can stay where you need to stay and this work can keep moving, right? So that we neither become the only bucket, the only thing that's holding it all together, and we also don't become a bottleneck, right? And so for me, it was like how I constantly think about the capacity of our organizations as one of the key solutions to actually create this balance. And that's really hard for organizations of color. That's really hard for Black organizations, because we're often, for many reasons, not resourced to actually build out the level of infrastructure that creates balance. So if there's one person who is responsible for, it was easy, like it's a simple example, like I'm no longer the only person who can sign a check. So I am no longer a bottleneck. If something happens to me, like the people will still get paid, right? And our board has been like deeply integrated into knowing about our program capacity, so that if I have to step away for any reason, and I have a father who has a terminal illness, and so these are things that we have to build container around, and it doesn't just serve me; it's for the entire team. For us to have a practice of, right now, if one person needs to step out, no one can say that's not my job, right? Like no one can say that's not my work. If CJ's actually out and the family needs us to drop off something, someone else inside of our organization, our political ecosystem, should be able to hold that, right? And should also be invested in those relationships in a meaningful way. So I think for us, what's at stake is like actually doing work. And I think what we are seeing, if we're being, in a room of family, is our work is stagnant right now. We are not moving at the level of power that is presumed based on how much time has passed, in part because some people who are holding the political rigor line are exhausted, and those who are not invested. And if you haven't found and identified your self-interest in this work, then you will prioritize rest over rigor, right? You will prioritize rest over rigor. And I think for us, this is for people who are more developed in this work, this is the like deep, we both have to build the bench. We have to continue to agitate our comrades around interest, right? And we have to prioritize like building some infrastructure to actually create balance between those two things. And yeah, and that's like really hard. But I think what is at stake is folks who are actually tired, like don't work over here, don't make what we make, don't have the privilege of unlimited PTO, maybe don't even get PTO at all, don't get paid when they're away from work. Those folks are exhausted, and we are the gap fillers of bringing those folks into this work and helping to mitigate harm against them. And so if that is not driving you in this work, then it will be imbalanced, and our output will be insufficient, and our community will feel that. And I think we are in a moment where movement is being critiqued because people have seen the resources come in, people have seen the individuals in like individualistic elevation of profile and prestige, right? And they're like, what is happening in our communities that actually is matching what's going on? And we have to, as people in movement, have a really honest conversation that we've let rigor fall by the wayside. And there are consequences to that. There's consequences to that, both internally to our organizations, externally between us and our communities, and long-term for our movement.
Thanks, Kayla. Sean, CJ, any one of you want to take a stab at that question? What's at stake? People or ourselves?
I mean, I agree with absolutely everything that Kayla said. I'm also deeply appreciative of Kayla for raising the issues around the privilege that many of us enjoy working in organizations where we are paid to do this work, whereas there are volunteers and individual activists involved in movements who are holding down jobs that pay an hourly wage, where people are struggling to certainly make ends meet, get any kind of benefits. So I think part of the challenge is, how do we help more people recognize that reality and feel like connected to and linked to the reality of people that are part of the community? And it also could be a function of, I work for a national organization that is an intermediary, right? I'm not doing the kind of organizing in community that I used to do earlier in my career. And so I think it is often, unfortunately, easy for people to be detached from those other realities that would help them have some perspective about what is the level of overwhelm that people are experiencing in order to do the work of supporting justice, versus the level of real burnout that people who are experiencing the everyday ways that our systems are keeping our communities down, right? And I think it's just been hard for people to articulate both things as being true, because I think it often feels like a way of shutting down what are often legitimate concerns or complaints of staff inside of organizations about overwork. But I do think we have to figure out a way to keep both of those realities in balance. And I think it's been a struggle.
And Abe, I'm gonna just say that what's at stake is, can Sister Marna in North Carolina, when we were knocking on the doors, can she pay for her cancer medication? What's at stake is, in Chicago, my Black babies are being murdered. How do we prevent those murders and atrocities from happening? How do we bury our babies? How do we fight and have fair judicial outcomes? These courts cost money, paying for ballistics, animations, a proper defense, even if you're innocent, costs hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the Mark Wilsons of the world, who has to spend 10 years in jail, what's at stake is bringing him home. What's at stake is the Johnson family, Kendrick Johnson, who was buried in mats and his organs taken away, where the Department of Justice and the FBI and the sheriff and the high school were all in cahoots to do a cover-up. What's at stake is to bring justice to that family, right? What's at stake is Roe versus Wade. What's at stake is our voting rights. What's at stake is really liberation, since they brought us over here on these chains. And so it is very, very, I mean, the urgency has to be there with the rest.
Yeah.
It has to be direct action with the strategy and the tactics and the planning. It has to be that balance. And so I go back to the frequencies and the vibrations. You have to operate on a higher vibration so that you can have a sense of urgency, but also have that balance to know what's at stake and know when to rest and know how to love your people, right? And know how to heal yourself first, because we suffer for so much trauma. What's at stake is our own trauma. We call ourselves organizers and activists and whatever for companies, but we're dealing with our own personal trauma. So what's at stake is you healing yourself. You can't ask people in the community to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. And oftentimes when we go into these various communities, they know if you full of, I was about to cuss and I'm a cusser, so I caught myself, but they know if you're healed, let alone lying, but they know if you ain't healed yourself. So when you go in and you're healing and working on yourself and you ask them to do the same thing, that's at stake. We have to heal first individually, so then we can go to the collective and say, let's heal and let's fight for our liberation. And I believe that's what's at stake as well.
Yeah, appreciate that, CJ.
I was gonna say one more thing, sorry. I was just gonna say that I think what we're all trying to say is like, we actually need to do the work of being able to name the reason we are tired. And that reason is that we are actually living under white supremacy and capitalism, and that is decimating our communities, which requires us to create movement infrastructure. And sometimes I think like that is always around us, right? We are not breathing clean air to run fast because of that. And this work is like really hard. You're taking in so much constantly. You're taking in so much. It's so deep. And I think we have to be able to name that reason, that we are both tired. Our people are both tired. This work is required because of these systems. And we have to name that, right? That like even in the construction of our organizations, we're constructing them in these systems, capitalism and white supremacy. They are influenced. The entire idea of building 501c3s and structures and having to deal with operations and development and all these things that are like, get us further and further away from, I'm in the office right now and our team just went out our field team just went out to Canvas. And I was like, oh, I got to go up here and have this call and I got to like send some emails, and like, that is so draining work. I love y'all, but like, that's so draining work. It's like, I actually want to go talk to someone and like connect them to this idea of what power is and tell them about our organization, and not to get a check, but for them to see their interest in this and for this to become their political home. I actually want that to be my job, right? I want to do that part. And I think we have to hold how much white supremacy and capitalism shape the work that we do. And that makes it also draining. So it's like we actually do, the more you get promoted into this work, or the more leadership you take on, the more you're away from the work that actually pours into your soul. And that is why we are also tired, right? And so like, for me, I'm like, okay, what my schedule changes. I'm like, I actually want to go out on Canvas. So like, I'm canceling all meetings on next Tuesday, because I'm like, I'm going to go outside with our field team and like spend the day knocking doors, because that work is like soul stirring to me. It's like, that work is important, not just being in these spaces. So I think like creating that sort of structure inside of your organization. And I think we can move with deep political rigor and build systems that create space for rest and restoration. And again, that comes back to me as like defining what rest is. For me, going to our monthly tenant meeting, there's a lot of work that goes into that, but I feel restoration every month in that space, because I'm with the people I'm fighting for. I'm watching people be politicized in real time. That work, I sleep great that night because I'm like, okay, we're doing the thing that we said we want to do. And I think that's really important. So I just think it's like, we have to, what is at stake is actually doing the work that we came into this movement to do. We come to work every day to get done, figuring out how to create space to see that work more clearly sometimes, because we can get away from it, right? We can get away from it. And naming that those systems are not just impacting people outside. They definitely have influenced the shape and containers in which we built these organizations. And what are we actively like interrogating and working together collaboratively to figure out how to combat that culture internally so that we can actually do the really beautiful external work that we crave, that feeds us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's real. The more you do move up, the more you do, I'm the operations person, but I miss knocking doors. I mean, me and CJ were
Ain't it nice?
it's
They be all
nice. It's
swagged
nice.
up, you know what I'm saying? I'm
Right,
like,
right.
I'm trying to go outside. They like, yo, we need gas for the van. I'm like, all right,
Hey,
that's my
yo,
job is to
Taylor.
get you gas.
Avery did a training, right? And he was talking about staying on the doors and somebody telling you everything that was going to happen in the community. And it's training. I swear, we went and knocked on the door, and the woman did everything that I was fully prepared.
Yeah, all the time. My team is like, I mean, I'm like, listen, I got to make the money there, I got to go get the money that clears so that every 2 weeks you get paid. That's my job. And also, I want to be on the doors. I'm like, I want all the smoke. You think, because to get here, I have to do that. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I actually am really good at that. And so I'm like, next Tuesday, the whole org is like, nobody's taking any meetings. We're all going outside because the other thing that feeds this like this culture of like rest and this combat of rigor is hierarchy in some structures, right? Like, oh, I don't have the same rigor as the ED because they are the founder or they have more power, right? So let them do it. It's like, no, every single thing matters inside of this organization. Our most significant work is our Canvas team who goes and talks to you. They are the front line of this organization before people may know my name, but they see their faces. You know what I'm saying? And that's like that work to me is like, we got to drop people back into that. And it's exhausting, but also I know for the team, for our field team, me coming out to knock doors is them being like, there's value in my work, right? I see the value in my work, and us creating actual moments of like collective learning, collective celebration, collective rest, anything I can make collective meals, right? Like if I know I'm about to go get food, I'm like, all right, let's do it for everybody. Those like collective moments, I think they are the balance to the way that like capitalism makes this work feel hyper individual and silos us into just thinking about what's on our plate and not what is on everyone's plate.
Thanks, Sean. So I know folks are they fixed the chat. The chat is open. I know folks have been wanting to give some praise. I also know folks have been listing some questions. I got some more questions. We got 2 more questions, and it may hit at some of the questions that y'all got around some of this stuff. So we're going to get there, and we're going to open up for Q&A. So feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A portion, and I'll try to get to them in this time, okay? And once I'm finished, next question. Have you been able to find rest and model it for other leaders within your organization? This might be a quick little question, okay?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also say no, but I think part of the reason I'm saying no is because, and I so appreciate, Kayla, what you said earlier about we need to be distinguishing between rest, which is often framed as an individual pursuit of like not doing what is our normal day-to-day, right? Like rest is often like individuals ceasing from the activity of work, right?
Yeah.
Whereas what you were lifting up is restoration, which can be collective, which can be experienced in that time post, an intense day of canvassing and door knocking, and it's like the meal time that people have collectively in community, right? And so I do think that if we could lift up this emphasis that you're raising around restoration and how do we like collectively rest up for fights as opposed to the individualistic pursuit of rest, I think things would feel different. And I'll also admit, I'm not sure that I've been able to do either, right? At least not in the last several years. So I would love to know what models there are. I think in some ways, I wonder how much what is the care and attention that gets paid to the community building, what that happens like outside of the organization with members, right? And how to integrate that into the care and community building with staff teams. I wonder if there might be possibilities there or glimpses of what might be possible. But if we think of rest as are people using all of their PTO? Are people taking vacation days? I definitely don't have much advice to provide there.
I have so many PTO days. Like I could just be off for the rest of the year, basically. But yeah, I think no, I haven't been able to find deep rest. I do too much. Like I know that I do too much, and I've worked 2 jobs for many years, and both are they're in like building roles, right? And so that's been hard to navigate. And what I keep thinking about, so like we just went through, like EB talk, we just went through like reviews in our organization. And I kept hearing this like craving from the staff to be like, I actually really don't know what this other person is doing. And so like, I don't know how to support, and we don't talk about that. And so for me, it's been like, what is the collective response to individual need? And sometimes I think of I get a question and I'm like, okay, is this a one-to-one answer? Is this actually like a structural thing that we need to build muscle to do? And I think that there are really important things that like we've done, right? It was some, like when we've separated sick time from PTO time. We did that like years ago, but it was like, that was a newer practice. We have our we don't have unlimited PTO. I know that that's like the trend. We don't have that, but we do have everyone has PTO, and then we have these like collective periods of rest. And what that essentially I think reflects to the entire team is like, that we have a summer break. We have the last 2 weeks of the year off. We do kind of post-peak breaks, so like campaign breaks. So after the election, we'll be shut down. And essentially what that does, and what we do, how we sort of shape our collective spaces, I think is really important. So for me, it's like, how do you actually build people's understanding that a sabbatical is good for the collective? One person taking a sabbatical is good for the collective, right? Like, how do we actually build that where it's not like, I don't see that as dreadful, like, oh, CJ about to be gone for 10 weeks, is about to be crazy. It's like, actually, I know that like CJ stepping away is going to bring CJ back clearer. And this all matters to us. And so how do we flank and encourage that? I think I used to be a pharmacy technician. That was my last job before movement. And when you would request PTO, it was like the bosses would just fall out. I don't know how many people had jobs like that, right? She like, I need to be off for 3 days next week. And they're, like the labor, like what's going to happen? It's like, yes, that work is still going to need to move. And also, have we built the container to actually like develop and interrogate how people can step into leadership in different ways to hold that work? But yeah, I think I've not always been able to do that. Yesterday was this really interesting day where I was like, y'all, we've been running. I need to get my hair done, right? These are fresh braids, and thank you. They look great. I know, thank you. And my team was like, I came in today and our organizer manager was like, several things happened yesterday, but I was like, Kayla needs this day. So I'm gonna figure this out. We go pull some other people in and we're gonna like run some scenarios. We're gonna get it done. And creating a container, like it's one day I got my hair braided. It was like not restful, it was painful. But creating the muscle where we can each say to each other, like, yo, if you need to take tomorrow off, I got you. And that sort of like love and care inside of our organization, I think is so important. And when we don't create opportunities for folks to think more collectively about this work, about our space, then we like limit the potential to actually practice care for each other, which I think in and of itself facilitates more restful culture.
Appreciate that. So folks started to name some of that stuff. Even though we don't practice it, what tips and tricks would you offer to liberatory leaders attempting to align the conditions within their organizations behind a healthy balance between rest, wellness, and/or political commitments? And our political commitments.
I'll just name a few. One, we already said collective rest, collective mapping, right? So for us, it's like sometimes the strategy lives in a smaller number of people's minds or on like a smaller number of people's work plan than the full organization. So as often as possible, painting that bigger picture and showing the like ebb and flow of the work in advance lets people know like they can see themselves in their restful periods like more clearly. That has been really helpful for me to be like, okay, if we're gonna call a retreat, don't call it for next week. Like give me some time in advance to be like, what do I need to best prepare myself for this? Or like, we have developed a structure that we have a campaign mode policy that essentially creates like blackout dates where it's like, listen, you know, like GOT is the easiest example, but also around budget and the end of legislative session, et cetera. And that work we actually share, right? So it's like, even if your work isn't, you're not the electoral organizer, you're not on that team, everybody's in campaign mode because everybody's working really hard and then everyone's going to rest. And I found that has just created balance and like shared commitments to see projects through in a way where I think sometimes when we weren't doing that, if like a certain team would be like, I'm hella tired. Another team would be like, I'm feeling great. So it's like, how do we do some collective mapping, some collective sharing, and some collective rest have been policies we built or structures that we built inside of Action.
Yeah, Kayla, all of that resonates. I think the curiosity I have is how are there ways to adapt or apply some of that for organizations where, you know, basically it's a hybrid work model and people are spread across the country and don't have the opportunities to do the kind of collective work that you're talking about that's in a way that's not mediated by a screen, right? Like I think that so much of the time when we're trying to do things collectively now, particularly for national organizations, it's like the collective is all of these boxes on a screen, right? That's completely, the quality of engagement is so vastly different from when folks are actually in person with each other. And there is this part of me that worries that particularly post COVID, there's been a hunkering down for all of us individually that many organizations have not figured out how to break out of or been necessarily interested in breaking out of. And so I do have this curiosity of like, what does it mean or what does it look like to have that kind of balance of rest, wellness, et cetera, in organizations where the primary mode that people have for engaging with each other is mediated by a screen rather than like real in-person engagement and relationship building.
So I was blessed to have a mentor who started the Gathering for Justice, and Harry Belafonte. And the Gathering for Justice, we were able to go to the indigenous community and spend time with the indigenous community and be in sweat lodges and see what wellness and health and working together in the community looked like from the indigenous community. We were able to go to the poor whites in Appalachia and build with our poor white brothers and sisters from the Cove and the Asian community in Santa Fe, and with our elders in EPS and learn about strategy and wellness and what worked, what didn't work. And the thing that I took away from all those things was that we have different ways of being spiritual and we have different ways of community. But one thing that I was sure about was that we were all connected in like just being human beings and what's best for our people, right? And so the tip that I learned is to whether you're organizational organizer, whether you're local or national, you can build with these communities locally, right? Like you can reach out to your brothers and sisters and build with them and to see what practices they do, right? Being open to Kenyan nonviolence or being open to sitting in the sweat lodge, right? It's all a healing. And so, and it's organizing, right? And it's learning what your brothers and sisters conditions and issues they're affected by and how we can be in coalition. So that was like, and conflict resolution training. I have two poets by the name of Muhib Dair and Kwabanan Nixon, who art and culture played a large part in a tip and a trick to even bringing people into the space to organize. And so the poetry, it used to touch my spirit, and it used to motivate me. Whenever I watched them do a conflict resolution training in a detention center or a prison, and I saw the effect that they had, not a dry eye in the house, but just finding what's going to touch your spirit in this work, and organize around folks who have different methods and different ways of as you said, building a healthy balance. That helped me, and hopefully it'll help someone out there listening.
Yeah. And I can add in, I think we've done some things at C2 that have been pretty helpful. In we know 2020 was a lot. I know Kayla was talking earlier about 2020. One thing that when we came together with Blackout, C2, BLLI, and Ruckus was we took a month off as an organization. And I feel like a lot of organizations started doing that afterwards, but took a month off of collective rest in a time where we weren't in a busy programmatic period a couple years ago, which, you know, we're not a base building organization. And I know that there's some tension there. Even Kayla's talked about we have a 32-hour work week, even though some people don't practice it. I can say that that's me. And you know, like one of the things when we started to do that a couple of years ago was like so folks could be involved in movement work, right? And do some of the stuff that we talked about in this call, right, in this panel around, you know, restorative stuff, right? We do a wellness stipend every month for our staff, right? So folks can get their nails done. You can use to get your hair done. You know, what does that look like? How do we have meals together? Even though we're in a pandemic, we're on Zoom, right? But there are folks in our staff that like to watch 90 Day Fiance and have a lunch, you know, have a lunch discussion on that, right? And it'd be lit, right? So how do we do different things like that? And know that, you know, I think Sean was bringing up earlier, like when somebody takes rest, what does that mean for everybody else in the organization? And we were all saying amen. But thinking about like we have an unlimited PTO policy now, and prior to that C2 didn't, so I just had a whole bunch of days that was adding up. It could take off for probably a whole year, if not, because it just kept adding up year to year to year and just carrying over. But now moving to an unlimited PTO thing, but also taking breaks, right? So every quarter, what does it look like that we make sure everybody's off? Because if not, then you're hitting up somebody else, right? In the organization, and they're not able to take a break. And so, you know, that's some of the stuff we've been able to do as a staff, and we're learning, right? As well. And it's a struggle, and it's a balance to try to do, and it's new. So I can't say it's the perfect thing, but that's some of the stuff we're trying to do.
I can say it's damn near perfect. I can say, since I've been there, it's been amazing.
Yeah, I'd also say that there's this important piece around that you mentioned, Avery, that's like feedback, right? That like creating space for folks to give feedback on like what is working. So for us, it was like, actually, you know, it's great that we have time off in December. When are you going to give us those dates, right? Like can we get those? And I was like, that's fair. Like, that's fair, because I'm like, it's 2 weeks. They like, well, we might have wanted to do something with them 2 weeks. So knowing 2 weeks in advance is not enough time, Kayla. And I was like, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so like creating muscle to like hold ourselves accountable to that and receiving feedback. Cause I think like this, we're designing containers to experiment with what we want the world to feel like, right? And that's hard to do when you are responding to the world as it is, but it is possible to create moments and infrastructure that allows people to show up as their full selves and actually, like contribute to strategy and thought and show and be given space to invest into that part of the work, right? That like operations isn't just operations, right? Operations impacts all of us. So whether it's, the like receipt protocol, people are like, listen, can we just take pictures of the receipt? I can't keep up with the paper version. We're like, yes, we can build structure for that. I think, for, like we have to be responsive in that way as like leaders. I think that's really important and like can't be understated. And I also think it's really, really important to like make space for joy. And I like that feels cheesy. I'm one of the people who critiques people who like use words like that a lot. I'm like, oh my God, like this is the work, you know what I'm saying? Like get to work. That's me. But also, it is important for us to laugh together. Like it's important for this space to not just feel like it only takes from you and there is nothing that pours into you. And that is how we like feed each other's souls, because this is soul work. Like I said, it's very difficult. And to think about doing the work where you are exposing yourself to structural, political, communal, violence, right? It's like, how do we create a container for like safe? We're all learning about like, what does it mean to think about safety differently in our organizations? What does it mean to hold a political line inside of our organizations? And what does it mean to experiment to build those containers where we're actually inspiring ourselves and our base of people to be like, yeah, what's up with 32 hours, right? That might not be a thing this year in every organization, but like, let's interrogate it, right? Like, let's think about what that looks like, or like, what is up with traveling together, right? And then our retreat can be like, our retreat can be this, or what's our family policy around these things? And that to me is like, allowing someone to bring themselves into this work and allowing them to take this work into their communal spaces that are not non-work related. I think they're just really important. And I think we've gotten it wrong sometimes because when things don't go well, we have been conditioned to defer to like punitive responses. And I actually think we can sometimes be more imaginative than that. And bring in the like question of why, like, you didn't do this thing that I need you to do, CJ. And we get taught to be like, okay, I need to respond to what you didn't do, and not actually understand the context of like what made that choice, the choice that you made, and like, is there support that I can offer in this moment? And I think that has been a learning curve for me as a manager, to create real space so that I'm actually interrogating the decisions I'm making as they impact others, and making space to hear about how people are making decisions that they're making on our team. And from that, sometimes it's helpful to learn, like, you can't get your work plan in on Mondays because X, Y, and Z, right? And so like, what's the structural thing that we change for that, And that has just been, I'm nerding out as an ED, but like, I just think that work is really, like, we have to take on the mantle of designing and experimenting with alleviating some of these practices that are deeply trenched in white supremacy and capitalism, which means we have to do things together, right? Because capitalism says that the top has more, and that just can't be how we design things inside of our organization.
Cool. Appreciate all of that. Y'all, we have hit through all of our questions that we had prepared. I tried to put in the chat that the Q&A was coming. I know a lot of folks asked about those tips and those tricks, which we got to as well. If there are other questions, feel free to put it in the chat. I'm looking at the chat. There's also the Q&A section here. And I also don't believe in keeping us the whole time if we ain't got to. Okay. Hallelujah. Okay. So if there aren't questions that pop up, we'll also start to wrap up as well.
Thank
Sure.
y'all.
There is, I'm not sure if Eugene's question was, it probably was answered by what we just were talking about in terms of effective organizational practices and policies
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
shape a pro-rest culture.
Yeah, I think it also means that, you know, one of the things is you could have these practices in place, right? But if ain't nobody following them, so it's really the commitment that happens to it. I know that if folks do a training on the organizing team for C2, like they work their weekend, right? So it's like that means that me as a supervisor, as a manager, I got to be like, all right, you taking a comp day, or else people will just model what I don't do it myself sometimes, right? I just keep on working, right? So if I'm not cognizant of it as a leader and a supervisor, it's like also, you know, I have to practice it, but I also have to do it. And then, you know, another thing that, you know, I guess I'm getting old in movement at this point, because it's like now I'm hitting a sabbatical period, and I've a lot of my friends are right. I'm starting to talk about sabbatical, but it's like C2 has had a sabbatical thing for years, and it's been after 5 years, and I've been at the organization 8 years, so at this point I'm like father time, and overdue. But it's like we were just talking, we just met as a leadership team, and it's like, oh, it's 5 years, but then after that, it's like I ain't gonna do another 5 years before we got another sabbatical. It's like 5 and then 3, right? And that's just something that we just switch as well. But it's like, you know, it hits to the point earlier. Now, will I take some time to go to the beach? Yes, but I'm also trying to figure out what's next and what's needed in movement, right? Like what are some of the things that, you know, I think is missing, and what's the gaps, right? And is there something I want to do that's about that ain't in it might be in operations, it might be in organizing, because I'm an organizer at heart, so that's what I want to do. And I can't be at C2 forever. I'm not staying here forever. Like I'm the longest serving staff.
Calm down, Avery.
I'll be here for 25 years. Okay. There's other stuff that I want to do. And what is that? Right.
Yeah, I actually think another thing is like, as organizations who are trying to figure that out, what is our commitment to like collective sharing? Because I have often, you know, like, because I have been sort of, you know, like a non-traditional pathway to become a director of an organization, I am so like committed to ensuring people who come after me don't have to build the stuff I had to build. It's like, baby, if you need a budget template, I got a budget template. You need a work plan template, I got a work plan template. If you need a handbook, I got a handbook. If you need, like, if you in St. Louis, people are like, okay, we're looking at healthcare. For us, it was, you know, like it was a political line that we're like, we're covering 100% of health insurance. We were one of the first organizations in St. Louis. And people were like, oh my God, you're so small. Isn't that expensive? Yes, but you know, that's the line that we're gonna hold. And what is our commitment to building? And I think C2 holds this vehicle really well, the space really well for collaboration, but also like, how do we just do that? Like, how do we just share that? Like, create real response to be like, okay, you know, actually, we've done some reflection around the sabbatical policy. After 5 years, we don't think you should wait 5 more years for the next sabbatical, right? We actually, and like, what's our commitment to creating space where we're saying, hey, if you come into this organization and you say to me, I want to be here for 5 years, I want to move up in leadership, I'm actually really interested in this. Like, how do we start to design practices and space to make sure that you stay in this work beyond just your job here at this organization, and that you feel that you leave this space. Like, I think one of the best signs that for me that I'm doing a good job is that people leave still feeling like this organization is family to them. And that's really important to me, right? It's like, even if you have found another job, even if we've sort of agreed that fit and culture are not like aligning, I want you to know that I'm still invested in like your wellness and your well-being and your trajectory in this work. And so like, what does that culture and practices look like, and how do we create like that? We create that container where people can come and gather from the shared learning in real ways that are not just like conferences and stuff like that. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah. Well, we're hitting 3:18, and I know we got to wrap. I don't know if folks got any closing remarks, because then I'll give you some time to rest, actually.
That was funny.
Any closing, CJ, Kayla, Sean?
No, I'm just like, I really don't, I'm a worker bee. Like I'm a person that doesn't really like to be on panels, or you won't really see me on news or anything like that. I like to just do the work, but whenever I can be on a panel with amazing people and talk like real information that our people can actually take to like liberate us, this was dope. It was like, so I felt like we was just having a conversation and building and having a meeting that like, I feel like we're doing the work right now, and I'm inspired by the conversation. So thank y'all for making this not seem like it was work. This was like beautiful to be a part of. Thank you for your moderation, and thank you for everybody that joined us.
All right, y'all. Well,
I mean,
John.
I was just gonna add, I mean, this has been a very like interesting conversation and provocative for me, in part because, you know, like we said earlier, like when I saw this list of questions, it's like, I'm not sure that I'm gonna have much to say about rest, right? So, and I think what's been really helpful in clarifying over the course of this conversation is, you know, how do we collectively shift the attention and demand to not just be about individual rest, and sort of like in terms of an individual state of not having to sort of do the work of the organization, to practices, policies, et cetera, that are about collective restoration and about collectively resting up for the future fights. Because I think everything around HR and all the policies that organizations can put in place are going to be in service of individual rest. You know, it's about increasing the, you know, PTO, like, which is very much, yes, it applies across the board, but it ends up being enacted individually. And that's the whole point, because it's, you know, it's like, and so there is this piece that is really, that I'm really wrestling with and sort of sitting with, and I don't know what the next steps are going to be, but this piece around rest versus restoration, rest versus resting up, it feels very provocative and worth continuing to dig into, both in terms of like orientation and framing, but also in terms of what are the actual practices organizationally and policies that are in which of those camps. And so that's part of what I'm really sitting with. So thanks.
I'm reading this question from Valerie, and I read it like 4 times because I'm trying to think of an answer to it. And I think, yeah, I think like where we are, I think that there's an inherent critique of like capitalism and exploitation in the conversation around rest. And I think that's a good conversation to have. How do we continue to interrogate the impact of a transactional work dynamic, right? And like, how do we move that away from something that is inherently about you only, like your only value to this organization is what you produce, right? And like that, I think we have to, as movement, we have to continue to interrogate that. And I think, you know, age and like, you know, different generations are holding this conversation very differently. Different exposure points from like your vantage point. If you were, you know, I was in my 20s and had been in the workforce, non-movement workforce for many years, and then came into this space and was like, yo, this is Lux living, you know, like that. Like I was like, what people get, y'all cover 100% of people health, you know, and like, and people are dreaming of a world in which there is not such a requirement of our labor and to tire us out and to run us into the ground. And I think that's an important conversation to have. And I think we have to always ask the question, who are we asking the question for? Am I working so that our people collectively have that, or am I working so that I have that? And I just think that that's a different, your positionality in that generates an answer that has implications on the organization that you're a part of. And so for those of us who are trying to hold the balance, none of us do it well, right? Like I'm not always as rigorous as I want to be. Some days I wake up and I'm not feeling it, and we have to be honest about that. Some days I don't have all the like grace and abundance and like light in my eyes for this work. And also I know that those moments are part of the longevity that is required of me to be in this work. It's not always gonna be exciting and soul stirring, and I'm always not in this like, I'm in this for life. I'll be like, "Ooh, where is retirement? Where's peace? Where's tranquility? Like, where's a break?" And how do we like create spaces to actually interrogate that with each other so that people can know, people can identify what they need and find what they need. And sometimes that means looking for an organization that has a 32-hour work week, or sometimes that means finding an organization that has unlimited PTO. And sometimes that means we just actually need to talk to each other and figure out what we can do to make this space better so that we're balancing that. And it's not just about having conversations about rest. It's also about having conversations about rigor. And sometimes we don't have as many conversations about rigor in this current climate as we do rest. And I think that is, that's a misstep.
Thank you, Kayla, for the final word. Avery had to step away as our moderator, so I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Kayla. Thank you, Sean, for giving us gems.
Thank you,
today.
CJ.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all of you who joined. We are about to close, but get y'all some rest. Join the organization, get involved, and let's get free. Peace out.
Take care, everyone.